Hey, it's John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Welcome to this Be a Black Belt Leader podcast. Today, I want to talk about the enemy within, because sometimes you can be your own worst enemy. Yeah, I know that's difficult to hear, but I want to say when I say sometimes you can be your own worst enemy, I want to say, yeah, sometimes me too. We can all be our own worst enemy. In fact, the voice we listen to, the voice that's speaking between our ears matters, because that voice is telling us what to do. And often, if we're listening to the enemy within, it's giving us guidance and suggestions and recommendations and demands that may not be in our best interest. Now, I've been rewatching the original Star Trek series with my granddaughter, Aubrey, as she's discovered the world of the Enterprise. Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, the rest of the crew. She loves science, and she's becoming a huge fan of science fiction. Now, we recently watched the episode, The Enemy Within. And if you've not seen Star Trek, you're not a fan, or you've never seen that episode, let me quickly break it down for you. A transporter malfunction splits Captain Kirk into two distinct individuals, one very cruel and animalistic, the other kind and docile. Now, in the search for the darker version of himself, Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and others aboard the Enterprise began to engage in conversations about the voices we listen to and who's actually leading our lives from the inside. Now, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the show yet, the transporter's repaired and Captain Kirk's two halves are reunited so he can continue to lead the Enterprise on its 5-year mission to boldly go where no man has gone before. I didn't share all that to give you a premise on Star Trek, but I did want to share a valuable lesson because, of course, there's a leadership lesson in Star Trek, just as there is as anything else that we experience in life. Here's the lesson I want to share today. Your success in life, or lack thereof, is often the result of listening to the wrong voice speaking between your ears. Now, Louis Benstock, who is the author of The Road to Successful Living, many years ago summed up what I'm sharing in this very pithy statement. He says, very often, we are our own worst enemy as we foolishly build stumbling blocks on the path that lead to success and happiness. Now, think about what he just said. We are our own worst enemies when we ourselves choose to build the stumbling blocks that impede our path, the path we're walking that can lead us to success and happiness. What was he saying? We are our own worst enemy within. Now, Ogmandino, commenting on Benstock's book, noted that you and I, we may have unknowingly erected major stumbling blocks that impede our success in life. Often these are failures of our own to learn from our mistakes, to learn from our failures. And as a result, we erroneously continue to listen to the same erroneous guidance as that enemy within speaks to us over and over again. And I think Einstein said this was the very definition of insanity, doing the same thing the same way over and over again, but expecting a different outcome. You know, I was thinking about this life lesson. My mind went back to playing football in high school. A lot of young guys that I grew up with, we played ball together. Our offensive coordinator, great guy, but he always opened every offensive drive of every game we ever played with the same play, split right, 52. It was a handoff to the tailback who would take the ball following the fullback and attempt to go outside the right tackle and get out into the secondary to pick up some yardage. The problem was every team we ever played had watched our films prior to the game. They knew this was always our opening salvo every time we took the field. As a result of that, they were prepared and they knew how to stop our advance. In fact, the opening 3 plays of almost every initial drive when we took the offensive field, we called the same 3 plays. And how many times did we go out for our first offensive drive and it was 3 up, 3 down, pump the ball? So let me ask you a question, which to me, the answer is obvious. If you know your adversary, your opponent, is going to be making the same opening move every time you engage in combat, would you not prepare in advance to thwart their actions and shut that offense down? I know I did that when I studied my opponents when I was fighting as a martial artist, and I competed in 4 states as a fighting individual, enjoyed it, loved it, but I studied the competition to understand what they did, how they did it, and to look for weaknesses in what they did. Now, of course, if you were going to know your adversary was going to make the same opening move, you're going to prepare for that in advance. And when it goes back to this story about football, the opposing teams we played consistently did that at every game. Now, one day during practice, I asked the coach why we always open with the same series of plays at the beginning of every game. His response I thought was interesting. He said, John, I'm trying to get the feel of the opposing defense and really begin to probe and look for weaknesses in the line and in their secondary. I then followed up by saying, well, coach, if our opponents are doing what we're doing and they're watching the replays of our prior games, they know we run the same play the same way every time we start a game. Why would they not spend all week preparing to stop the first three plays that we call that are always the same? Now, my coach paused for a moment. Let me say he paused for a long moment. And you could see and almost feel the internal struggle within that he was having with himself. He didn't say a word. He patted me on the helmet and said, son, go back to practice. Nothing more was said before, during, or after practice. But something interesting happened. The following Friday, we took the field. And as the offense started out for its first drive, the offensive coordinator grabbed the quarterback and he said, open with split right 44. The quarterback looked at him kind of puzzled. And the offensive coordinator said again, open split right 44. The quarterback went out and into the huddle and he called that play. Everybody in the huddle looked around at each other because this was something unique and different. Now, the formation looks identical to the play that we'd always called for our opening salvo. But this time, instead of the ball going to the tailback, who would take the ball off to the right side and attempt to go outside the line and get into the secondary, this time the fullback would dive straight up the middle, following the center and the guard, and have an opportunity to drive the ball straight up the middle. Now, interestingly enough, the opposing defense had, as anticipated, shifted their focus to the outside tackle because having watched the films and preparing in advance, they knew historically this was where our first strike always happened. The cornerback had cheated up. The safety had cheated up. There was no fear we were going to throw a pass. The linebacker had shifted from his position in the middle to the left side of the defense, preparing for us to move to our right and his left. The opposing team was in anticipation of the handoff going to the tailback as he was going to attempt to get outside running off tackle. So our initial play, split right 44, it caught the defense by surprise. And where we typically picked up maybe 1 to 2 yards on a first down, if that, the fullback drove into the line, following the blocks of the center and the guard, and he drove the ball forward for almost 5 yards. We were halfway to a first down on our very first play of the game. Now I looked to the sidelines and I caught my coach, and he smiled ever so slightly and he nodded in my direction and simply called the next play. Nothing more was ever said, nor did it have to be, because in that moment, this veteran coach of many seasons had tuned out the familiar voice, the enemy within, that had continually told him to keep doing the same thing the same way as he'd always done and to try something new. My coach had discovered and conquered his enemy within. Understand this. Sometimes our own worst enemy resides between our ears. Now, one of the ways this enemy manifests itself is through the blaming of other people. It's so much easier to point the finger at others than to point it back at ourselves. And rather than admit we were wrong, we want to attach responsibility and blame for our failures on our circumstances, our situations, but all too often we want to blame other people. Now, this is a recipe for failure. I've been to the country of Africa twice, in Zambia 2015, Cameroon in 2017. And I can't wait to get back to this amazing country and spend time teaching leadership to these incredible people. But the enemy within can be found in every country, in every town, and within every person. I was talking to a doctor who was there from the United States, and he was operating a medical clinic. He was telling me that one of his greatest challenges in this small rural part of Africa was the strong belief of the people in witchcraft and superstition and their initial distrust of medicine. In the minds of these primitive but wonderful people, it wasn't what made them ill. They always asked, who made them ill? The enemy within always wants to seek to blame others than to take responsibility. Let me explain what I mean. Rather than acknowledging it was a lack of hygiene, dirty food preparation habits, improper food storage practices, parasites in the drinking water, a failure to quarantine those who were sick and contagious, a lack of immunization for infectious disease, along with unhealthy lifestyle practices, these people had grown up in a culture believing there was a supernatural explanation for what they couldn't explain and did not yet understand. They wanted to blame a who rather than a what. I saw the same thing when I was in Guatemala. The same dirty machete that was used to work in the jungles was used to cut fruit or carve meat for the family to eat. It was never cleaned. Villages drank from contaminated water full of parasites. Because of a lack of medicines, even general antiseptics like alcohol and hydrogen peroxide, along with a general lack of education when it comes to hygiene or cleaning a wound, even simple wounds often became infected, spreading sickness throughout the body. Once again, the people wanted to blame a who rather than a what, because it was easier to blame a nameless, faceless deity than to point the blame at their own lack of education, their lack of knowledge, or an admission that they were responsible for making themselves and their own children sick. But here's what I found. You don't even have to go to a third world country to see the enemy within. You only have to look in the mirror and take a look at yourself. If, like me, you grew up with siblings, it was a lot easier to point the finger at a brother or a sister when we got in trouble and say, well, it's their fault. They made me do it. It was easy to blame the dog for eating the homework or blame the teacher for talking so fast you never heard her give the homework assignment in the first place. And as a result of that, you failed to do the math homework you knew you had to get done because you were more interested in playing outside or watching cartoons. Come on, we all likely did that at some point. Here's the takeaway from that. The enemy within started speaking to us early. And if we never learn to recognize and ignore the voice of the enemy within, today we're continually repeating the same mistakes as the enemy within gives us guidance and advice that doesn't serve us well. You know, it's been said that the practice of blaming others accounts for nearly half of our failure in life. Think about that for a minute. The practice of blaming others accounts for nearly half of your failures, my failures in life. Half of your failure in life is listening to the enemy within, who keeps telling you to ignore the truth and to blame those around you for your failure to learn the lessons life is trying to teach you. You're failing to cash in on life's lessons failure's trying to teach you. And as a result, you're failing to grow, you're failing to learn, and you're failing to become a better version of you in the process. So what's the end result of that? Hear me when I say this. You remain smaller than you could be, weaker than you should be, and less successful than you ought to be. Let me say that again. Because you're listening to the enemy within, you remain smaller than you could be, weaker than you should be, and less successful than you ought to be. Now, unless you realize the greatest battle you may need to fight today is the battle within yourself against the enemy within, you're going to remain defeated. You're going to live far below your potential, and you're never going to rise to truly become the successful person you were put on this planet to become. And when greatness doesn't shine within you, it doesn't radiate to those around you who need you to be great for them. So take some time this week to go spelunking, cave diving. I want you to take a deep dive within yourself. And I want you to go there for one purpose, to uncover your own enemy within, to learn to recognize its voice and the lies it's whispering to you every single day. Those untruths, those half-truths, and those outright deceptions that are holding you back, limiting your success, and stifling your growth as a black belt leader in life. And when you do that, here's what's going to happen. You're going to gain a new level of mastery over yourself. You're going to become more decisive, more insightful, and more successful as a result. And who doesn't want more of that? And maybe, just maybe, you'll gain an even deeper appreciation of the words Mr. Spock so eloquently said, live long and prosper. I'm John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and I want to say thanks for joining me for this Be a Black Belt Leader podcast. Have a great day.